Hello, I'm Darkwell Bled, and welcome back to Beyond the Rusted Gate, bringing you stories of horror, sci-fi, and suspense every fortnight. Today's story, The Walk Home. Michael awoke, sat up just partially, and bumped his head hard. It was dark, and as he was usually a heavy sleeper, he was not accustomed to waking while the sun was not yet out. The air smelt musty, damp, earthy, and thin. Deep breaths failed to relieve his lungs, and as if he were atop a mountain, Michael could not help but feel endlessly deprived of oxygen. This was an awakening for Michael unlike any other. This was an awakening in which Michael had been buried alive. There was a part of him that vaguely knew of his situation the moment he had bumped his head against the coffin's lid, or perhaps even before he had sat up. This knowledge was, however, not entirely conscious. Instead, it was revealed to him by that quiet voice that whispers often ignored and unseen truths, deduced by the subconscious and often mistaken as premonition. It was the voice of insight that, without apparent evidence, would correctly conclude from the minutest clues everything from spousal cheating to the coming rains, and deliver its discoveries in the form of unease and discomfort. However, aided by the smell, the cramped space, the shortage of air, and the darkness, it did not take long for Michael's conscious to catch up with the horrid truths of his unconscious's insight. Within moments, he quite rightly reasoned out his predicament, and it pained at him as the ultimate rejection. Michael knew that he was not the first person to have been buried alive. As a boy, he could recall having heard schoolyard tales of live burials having taken place. He distinctly remembered stories of bells being tied to toes so that, in the event of such unfortunate happenings, those wrongly suspected of being a corpse could simply wriggle their foot to alert those above of their premature interments. These cases, as he understood them, had, however, been in antiquity. Occurrences such as these were of the domain before medical science broke from natural philosophy to become a true discipline in its own right. In this day of technological marvels, what possible excuse could there be for the likes of him, or anyone, to find themselves in such a situation? In all his adult life, Michael could recall no such incidents in modernity of this having ever occurred. Wriggling his toes, Michael noted that he himself had no such string. There would be no bell to tell of his predicament. Michael began to recall the unpleasant schoolyard tales of those who, like him, had been buried without a bell mechanism. Stories of bodies exhumed decades too late, their coffins revealing scratch marks and embedded fingernails, the jaws of their premature occupants' skulls twisted in horrified screams unheard. Memory and imagery flow more freely in the lonely dark, and these tales quickened Michael's breath and heartbeat and ate away at the already depleted oxygen. Michael would have to combat his panic with forced calmness and reflection were he to avoid perishing in the dark damp. He took a breath and held it. It was dark and it was damp, and Michael slowly began to fathom just how wet his surroundings were. From above him, soft muddy droplets dripped periodically onto his cheek. It had been a cold autumn, and it had been a wet autumn, and evidently it was or had been raining. Despite Michael's shortness of breath giving evidence that both the coffin and hole in which he was buried were fairly airtight, waterproof it evidently was not. Now fully awake and entirely free of grogginess, Michael noted that he lay in what was roughly half an inch of muddied water, within which he could feel the movements of soil-dwelling creatures as they curled and wriggled around him. But why was he here? There were ways to tell whether someone was dead, weren't there? This had happened before in the Dark Ages, but this was the 21st century. Sure, people would fall into comas or find themselves deeply unconscious, but these days one shouldn't be buried unless they were dead, and they shouldn't be considered dead unless a doctor was entirely certain of the matter. He had, of course, been sick. This could be said to be true for most of Michael's adult life. He had, amongst other things, a weak heart, underperforming kidneys, dizzy spells, poor eyesight, and flat feet to boot. And, as of late, his health had gotten worse. Somehow. Michael tried to concentrate through the pounding headache. A lack of oxygen can cause headaches and lethargy. He shook his head to try and clear such negativity, but in doing so only made himself more lightheaded and more dizzy. He couldn't quite remember how he had gotten worse or when he had gotten worse, but despite this gap in recollection, two things were abundantly clear. Firstly, that he had, at some point, gotten bad enough that some crackpot quack had declared him dead, and secondly that he would need to free himself of his new home soon, lest he suffocate from lack of oxygen or drown in the rising pool of mud and worms. Through careful, minimalistic maneuvering, Michael was able to reposition his hands from down by his sides to in front of his face, and by lightly tapping on the lid of his oppressive confines, he was relieved to learn that his wife had indeed gotten him as cheap a coffin as his will had stipulated. She had seen him buried, not in an expensive casket of well-fitted materials, as she herself thought proper, but instead a coffin constructed cheaply of wooden planks and nails, barely a crate in design. It was from no other motive when requesting such burial methods than a want for financial frugality and a desire to avoid post-mortem ostentation that had led Michael to choosing such a cheap final resting place. Regardless of reason, however, the thin wooden planks of his surroundings gave him a chance, though marginal, of escape. He ran his fingers along the planks where they joined in perfectly, and felt as he did so the dirt and mud disturbed by his actions fall through the cracks, dropping like cold raindrops onto his face and chest. For a second he felt a ping of regret for not having asked to be buried shallow, but then found himself merely grateful to not have opted for cremation. The situation, while dire, was not hopeless. On a dry day, any escape from his grave would likely be impossible. Despite the cheapness of his coffin, it was brand new, and it would be unlikely to yield to any pressure he could possibly muster. These were, however, fortunately not the optimal conditions designed for the coffin. With the added weight and strain from the rain and dampened soil, there was a chance, however slim, that he could cause the wooden planks that surrounded him to buckle and break. Pounding his fists upwards with as much force as he could muster within such close proximity, Michael began to hit upon his coffin's lid, attempting to cause it to cave in upon him. At first it was slow work. With each pound it seemed that the planks and certainly the dirt, excluding the small clumps that fell through the cracks, gave no ground. This changed, however, quite suddenly. Through the shifting weight of his hits and the increased weight of the soaked soil, the planks gave and the earth collapsed inwards. It was reflex and reflex alone that allowed Michael to inhale deeply, consuming what little was left of his oxygen, just as the dirt cut off any hope for further relief. The weight was crushing, and the wooden planks dug painfully into his legs and abdomen, driven in like nails by the pressure above. Human nature left Michael and was replaced by animalistic terror. Thus it was not the civility of man, but survival instinct, pure and bestial, that drove him to claw, wriggle, and writhe his way upwards towards the surface. Michael moved like a worm through the dark soil. Were it not for the rain, he could never have made it farther than the collapsed coffin, but so malleable had the land become that he swam as much as he crawled. Through mud-like water and through terror and encroaching darkness, he swam as the black mud of the grave slid down his throat and attacked his lungs with a painful growing pressure. The mud drove the threat of suffocation through his mind with a dull thudding thunder that his ears echoed and his pulse raced, then slowed despite his adrenaline and building fear. Michael found himself deafened by silent echoes screamed from the deepest recesses of forgotten space. Michael had been sick. There was no moon tonight, only blackness, and he had been sick. He remembered his sickness as he lay flat on his back beside his own open grave. He had no recollection of having made it through the last few feet of earth. That journey had been made by the same subconscious controls that had first noted his peril. It was still raining, and the drops fell down upon him heavily, washing the dirt and the worms and the maggots from his flesh so that they pooled in the small puddle that marked the indentation of his collapsed coffin. Here rests Michael Andrews, his headstone claimed, and with effort he struggled to his feet, intent on making a liar out of his own grave marker. Standing and limping, Michael made his way painfully through the blackness, past several other similarly pooling graves along the soaked mud and neglected path, and out through the iron gates of the hillside cemetery. He was not the only one to have found his way out this evening, and yet they all walked alone. It occurred to Michael through vague and distant memory that this was the first time in some while that he had walked at all. Before the coffin and before the burial, he had been sick. Really sick. Bedridden with some kind of flu or virus of the blood. Weakened, drowsy, dying. Michael remembered his doctor having assessed as he reached the porch of his family home and rapped upon the door. In the rain, Michael found his memories flowed freely. He remembered clearly now, almost obviously, that he had been dying. Not only that, but he could even remember having died. Strange. The door swung open, suddenly breaking Michael from his thoughts as the image of his wife appeared before him. Immediately he was sickened. His wife, once so lovely to him, appeared now poisonously tainted by the flare of life. Her skin, though paled slightly by fear, was pinkish white and held to her flesh in a disgusting display of youth and vitality. It showed no wrinkles nor blemish. Her widened eyes shone bright blue and clear white. Her red lips were uncracked and unpeeled. She smelt of fresh perfume and summer days, and she began to scream. Michael took a half step back, repulsed by what he saw, but entirely unsure why it disgusted him so. He couldn't understand what she was screaming at either. She was, he supposed, justified in her surprise, seeing that he was supposed to be dead, but before he could finish reasoning out such things, she fainted and Michael was forced to catch her and ease her to the floor. Her skin was warm to the touch and Michael drew back in disgust, still unsure of what it was that disgusted him so. She repulsed him, but as he stared at her, he could not fathom why. She was, seemingly, objectively no different to when he had last seen her. He stood and saw the hallway mirror previously obscured by his fainted wife. She had not changed, and she had been right to scream. Staring back at Michael was a reflection, his own reflection, though he did not immediately recognize it. He was lit by the porch light which cut through the night and revealed rotten flesh peeled away to show bone, maggot-infested, crawling with worms, dark grey and white with mold. His was the visage of the damned, the dead, the forgotten, and the beyond. Stirring, his wife murmured quiet nonsense, and even in her semi-conscious state emitted an aura of life now hateful to Michael, a vitality which invoked within him bile and sick. She had become to him the other, and to look upon her was to poison in him her memory. She had become as lost to him as he had to her. Limping and dragging his way back towards the cemetery, Michael clawed at the damp earth and did his best to return to his new home. The flesh from his hands and the nails from his fingers gave more easily than the dirt he clawed, and as he dug he soon saw bone and tendon. Around him Michael saw that others too had begun to return. Some sobbed and some whispered of what they had seen, but all dug towards their graves. Thanks for listening. That was The Walk Home. If you would like to hear more spooky stories, then be sure to check out the back catalogue if you haven't listened yet. I think this is the 7th or the 8th one I've uploaded. And also make sure you subscribe and tune in next fortnight, as I'm doing one of these every 2 weeks. Until then, I have been and still am Darkwell Bled, and you have been listening to Beyond the Rusted Gate.